a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, listeners. If you've been listening the last few weeks, you know that Memoir Nation is live. We have officially kicked off the site where you can go and sign up to be a member for just $99. Please just go look at the website too, because we have a free level and we definitely want everyone who wants to come in at that level as well. Out the gate, the $99 membership, though, gives you a lot of perks, including a weekly newsletter with lots of memoir insights, tips, advice, and encouragement. You also get bonus podcast content and a code for a future free class. And at the next level, we also have a few extra goodies, which include being part of our accountability group and all of the classes we have on offer. So don't discount that one for sure. And if you've been a longtime listener, we just want to say thank you, but also to say that we're going to be accessible and doing lots of community stuff over at Memoir Nation, and we want you to be a part of it. We'll make it worth your while to come hang out. So we thank you in advance for supporting us to create the space that we've been dreaming of for writers like you, for writers like us. Visit memoirnation.com to see more. And thanks.
Hello, iPhoneistas, Facebookers, Instagrammers, AIers, and life searchers in general. I'm Grant Faulkner, a person who is both fortunately, I guess, and unfortunately shaped by the technology I've chosen to use, or the technology that's chosen to use me, perhaps rather. And I'm with my Memoir Nation co-founder and co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, I'm very interested in talking with our featured guest, Vauhini Vara, today, because she's written a memoir called Searches, but it's a memoir that's very different than other memoirs. And I'm calling it a techno-memoir because Searches refers to several different kinds of searches, you know, the search for a dead sister in one chapter, the search for self and all the manifestation that takes, and then searches as in internet searches, which also, you know, form themselves around all sorts of manifestations. And I think it's a really important memoir because one function of memoir is to reveal the textures of a life, you know, and to delve into what makes a life and to explore the labyrinth of its conflicts and desires. And when I think of the heritage of memoir and what it's known for, I think of books on, you know, like mental health and addiction and dysfunctional families and cancer, you know, problems that are very much a part of our bodies and our minds. But this memoir focuses more on how we're technological beings as well, and then the companies behind that technology. And strangely enough, I hadn't thought about myself as being, you know, so much a part of this weird meta algorithmic cyberspace until reading this, because Vauhini essentially, you know, she grew up with the internet more so than I did. And I guess we all grew up with the internet in our way, though, you know, no matter what our age is. And at this point, you know, I'm 60 and the internet has essentially been a part of my life for now 50% of it, to the extent that I'm having a harder and harder time remembering what my life was pre-internet. And I asked myself, you know, like, how did we get places? Did maps really work? Because I can't really even remember using them. So on that note, Brooke, I thought we could explore our own technological selves as if we were writing a memoir like Searches to start. And so I'm curious, what is your first internet memory, or your first technological memory where technology literally like shaped you, that you were conscious of it?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's even a really good writing prompt. I clearly remember when the internet came into my awareness, in part because I was abroad. I was living in Spain. And so people were writing letters to me saying that there was this thing called email. So that was an interesting experience because I couldn't wrap my mind around it. You know, one of my friends was saying I could get an email address and then we could communicate. And the whole concept was so foreign to me that he might as well have been asking me to teleport home. Like, it just didn't make sense. You know, looking back, Grant, I'm really grateful that I was able to do that year abroad pre-internet, because I know I would have had such a different experience if I had had email. And then, in fact, I did have another experience a few years later after college. So my first year abroad was 1993, and the second year abroad was 1999. And of course, in 99, I did have email, and I felt far less disconnected to home, but I wouldn't say it was better. You know, the internet connects us, but there's also something really beautiful about being disconnected. And I am sad for these generations that follow us, because if they want to be disconnected, they have to force it upon themselves, you know, rather than it being imposed. And I don't know. I just think like a lot of kids today, and even their parents, wouldn't have the willpower to go a whole year. Certainly, you know, the art of letter writing is dead. Like, why would you do that when you can email? So it's pretty profound. 1993, like I said, very specific, although I did have a family computer before then. But I'm curious, Grant, what about you? What's your first internet experience or memory?
Yeah, just as you're talking, I'm thinking that these probably already exist where people pay money to have the internet taken away so that they can read books and write letters and
100%.
Disconnection camps. Anyway, they sound very appealing, even though it's strange that you would have to pay for such a thing. When I think about it, I barely can remember that first experience, and I often joke that I was literally one of the last people to go to college with a typewriter in hand, not to mention several bottles of whiteout. And I'm not sure my kids even know what whiteout is. But when I got to college, there was this very rudimentary kind of campus-based email system, and people were beginning to type their papers on school computers. And as I remember, it was kind of like a text system. It wasn't quite email. And I can't remember if we came up with names or if it used our real names or if it was anonymous. But I do remember, kind of it being a place for odd flirtations and jokes with friends. But I don't remember quite specifically how it worked. But I did once talk to an English teacher who told her students, I thought this was very effective, that they needed to become good writers in order to become good flirts online. And I always thought that was a kind of funny and accurate. So maybe that's my first memory, kind of flirting through pixels and text. But we had to print out papers back then on that dot matrix paper that was connected, with a big stack of perforated pages. And I actually typed my papers on a typewriter through college, though, and I continued to type my stories for submission to lit journals for at least a couple years afterwards. So I didn't feel technology shaping me until I was more into my adulthood. And but now it's so odd because I literally probably check my phone every 10 seconds. And if I don't have my phone in my pocket, like I left my house recently without it, and it felt like I'd left my arm behind, literally, my phone is a type of physical appendage. It's got a location in my brain, and my head and my thoughts definitely live in cyberspace to a large degree. And Brooke, I'm just kind of thinking back to our own discussions or experience of technology. And I remember one of our first technology or social media discussions was during a car trip we took to some speaking engagement that we were each booked at. And we were joking that if we didn't know each other that well at this time, but we were joking that if we were more attuned to social media, we'd be filming ourselves in the car and coming up with a plan to post photos of ourselves driving and speaking and everything. And the irony is that I think we probably both got much more involved in social media and technology after that, just by necessity. And now we're both regular posters on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, just to name three. So just going back to social media, though, since now we do have a whole deep history with social media, what was your first social media memory?
Yeah, I mean, my first social media memories in general are around Seal Press, because I was working at Seal Press when all of that was starting. Most of my authors were early adopters. I mean, every author that is savvy out in the world is jumping on the next new social media thing. And so in my awareness, it was like, first it was Facebook, then later was Twitter. It made more sense to me that my authors were on it. Like for a long time, I just didn't think I belonged there because I was an editor and I wasn't growing my own platform. I was just working. And so it wasn't in the early days something that I saw for myself. But then of course my friends started getting on there and my friends started asking me why I wasn't there. Like everything, Grant, I mean, I think I've spoken this many times that I am a late adopter. I'm a late adopter to everything because I watch it and I'm like, I don't really want to be a part of it. And then pretty soon I get drawn in. And so that reluctance hasn't changed. And, now, yes, I am on all the social media platforms minus TikTok and Blue Sky. But as I have said lots of times, the one platform I really love is Substack. So at least I can be a champion of one platform that is kind of a bloggy social media platform.
Yeah, more substantial. I guess I still have some of that reluctant attitude myself, but I'm not even sure anymore because it has become such a part of my life. And it's interesting to go back in time and chart our internet experiences, because Vauhini does various searches of herself online. And even though she's really tying this to a larger point about capitalism and the technology companies who own this information, it's also almost like she's paging through a scrapbook, like reading through her searches. I get a very interesting portrait of her as a person, but it's not a scrapbook with photos and newspaper clippings. She's really going through all of her searches on Google, which tell a lot about us. And, it's the same for me. I went back into my timeline on Facebook and, I've forgotten so much of that, right? But it shows that I joined in late 2008, which is when I joined Twitter as well, although I've since deleted that account. And, I didn't remember any of my initial posts, of course. But then you can actually go back and read everything that you've posted. And I was posting pieces, I wrote on my blog. And just, you could tell I was just trying to figure out how to use this thing. So I started reading my comments. And one of note is that this was my first status update, is that on December 29, 2008, my birthday, I wrote that I was making endless trips to load the car and questioning whether a trip to the snow is actually worth it. Probably still questioning that, but I must have been taking my kids up to Tahoe or something. Some kindergarten parents who I'm no longer even in contact with commented that the snow was worth it. And my current ornery self actually wondered what would happen if I replied to their comments now, 17 years later, and how they would respond. It's kind of like a trick or, ghost in the machine. And it just, brought up also the fact that the internet doesn't age in this way. I can actually go back in time and have types of conversations. So next question. Has your engagement with the internet shaped you in any way? Like, has it changed the way you view or experience life or others or companies or yourself? And I know that's a big, broad question, but if you can think of one small or large way that your consciousness, your feelings or experience of life is different, that would be really interesting, especially because we're talking about memoir and technology.
Yeah, 100%. It is a huge question. Funny enough, Grant, I checked and I also joined Facebook in 2008. So we must have both been late to the party because I remember being like, wow, I'm late. Mm-hmm. But of course, the internet has shaped me because it's so interconnected with what I do for a living, what we do for a living. There's the internet and then there's social media. Where the internet is concerned more broadly, I can't even imagine modern life without it. I don't even think I would want to. I love the fastness of it all. I might still be in book publishing, but we wouldn't have any of this. I wouldn't have the classes that I teach, our podcast, Memoir Nation, our community. That's all possible in its iteration that it is, right? Because of how we interact with each other online. Social media for me, sadly, I think it's kind of become a net negative over time. I realize that it's necessary for authors. We use it to build our platforms. Maybe if someone took it away from me, I might realize I actually appreciate it. But I think that it's this thing that's imposed upon us, right? And our kids feel that too. I actually had a very interesting interaction with one of my son's friends that when TikTok was threatened to go away for, a day or two and then came back online, and he said, I wish it didn't come back. And this is a 14-year-old, and so I was like, God, what are we doing to our kids?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm shaped by it. I think about it every day. I interact with it every day. We're all dealing with these existential questions, ranging from our interactions to social media to AI. And given the work that we do, we're all up in it, right? So I wouldn't even want it to change. And the only way it could change would be if I were to drop out and move to Iceland, which, it was kind of tempting when I was there on my recent trip in March, Grant. So I don't know. I'm sure I think you have a more positive relationship with social media, but I can't imagine either of us being like, no more internet.
Yeah, I'd have to go in one of those camps I pay for, or the 14-year-old boy who you mentioned. It's almost like he was speaking as an addict, right?
Yeah.
Like he's using this thing that doesn't give him pleasure, but he needs to use it. Or that's the way I was taking the comment. And, I think the connectivity to so many people is life altering, even though, like you said, we kind of take it for granted now. And pre-internet, a lot of people, I read about this, how a lot more people sent Christmas cards or they went to their high school reunions because there was a need to do that. And now fewer and fewer people do each of those things because there's just less of a need to, because you're on the internet together. You see what's happening with people's lives. And, by pre-internet standards, it would be unlikely I'd know where so many people from my past live, or what they eat for dinner, or how they voted, or what illnesses they have, and where they go on vacation. And sometimes I wonder if we're supposed to know so much about so many people. I know all this about them, and I don't have to have a brief conversation with them once every 10 years or so, or once every lifetime when I go back to a high school reunion to find that out. And I suppose there's some goodness in that. But that said, I often say, thank God I grew up before the internet. I'm so glad I got to experience the world in that way. And I'm sad that my kids won't, to tell you the truth. And I think that's part of the subtext in this book. And one of the searches is just how to live in this new world, even when we're growing up with it. And for example, Vauhini goes through her own ethical dilemma of shopping at Amazon, and it's a personal soul search and behavioral search for her. She has a debate with a friend of hers, and this friend won't shop at Amazon at all for political and ethical reasons, but also just to exert control over her life, not to give up her life to Amazon and its algorithms and conveniences. And it's interesting to watch as Vauhini reckons with Amazon on similar levels, and then also how Amazon has embedded itself into her life and our lives. For example, like her child's teacher has an Amazon wish list. So she has to buy things from that wish list for the class so that other parents can see what has been purchased. It's hard to avoid Amazon. It's such a big part of our lives. And the ways the other questionable companies have embedded themselves in our lives is, totally disturbing in this book on a bunch of different levels. And I recently got rid of my Twitter account and had to say goodbye to all of my 10,000 followers there because of Elon Musk's politics and just the entire environment that he's created there. Yet I'm still on Facebook and Instagram, and I don't agree with many of the things that Mark Zuckerberg has done. For example, just the rudiments of his company, he created social media to be addictive, and that's part of the business model. It's a known part of how they designed Facebook. And so Facebook, in a way, is no different than a cigarette company, and it's harming us and our kids as much as tobacco does. Yet, there I am every day, essentially enjoying my smokes or my likes, you might say, and we're not only enjoying them, but Facebook and Instagram are, instrumental and necessary tools for my career. So I'm guessing you might feel similarly.
Yeah, I do, and I think many of us are conflicted. And I think what's happened for me is that I have enjoyed it less over time. And I haven't always felt that way. I posted more often previous years, but I think it's the politics. I think it's the echo chamber. It's the outrage, all of that stuff. And on the other hand, the reason that I'm there is because my authors are there, which I love. I want to follow them, but I also find that challenging sometimes because there are so many people and then you feel like you can't stay on top of it. So it's like all of the stuff comes kind of flooding in as a pressure as well. And sometimes I feel like when I go away from social media, it's like I'm crawling under the covers and hiding, so I think that's my vibe about 80% of the time these days. Grant, I'm curious, if you were to write a memoir like Vauhini's, how would the internet be a part of it?
I don't know. I was very fascinated by the experience of viewing all of my searches as a kind of personal scrapbook. And so when Vauhini goes through her search history to see what Google knows about her and how it might monetize her searches, I checked into mine, and I had completely forgotten that I disallowed Google from collecting my searches. And I don't know when I did that. I don't remember it, but I did find, I was very taken or a little bit obsessed by my YouTube history. YouTube has a record of every video I've watched. And so I scrolled back through my timeline and actually took a lot of pleasure both in seeing, many of those videos were kind of kooky, and obviously I was doing something and needed to do searches and find things. But others were like super predictable, videos of writers speaking and stuff like that. But it became a type of playlist for my life, both in terms of the music and the videos of writers and other people speaking. And I once read one of F. Scott Fitzgerald's biographers say that he was an interesting subject for a biography because he kept these meticulous records of all of his expenses and income. So the biographer could essentially tell his story through his receipts, or through his ledger. And we actually create this really interesting, comprehensive life story through our searches. And that's one thing that makes her memoir so interesting. We're searching creatures just by definition. And now, for the first time in history, part of the way our brains work and interact with our lives are essentially being recorded, for better or worse.
Isn't that the truth? Well, listeners, you might curiously go and search online to remind yourself of what year you joined Facebook or what your YouTube history actually looks like. And while you're doing that, we will be on our musical interlude and on our way to our interview with Vauhini Vara right after this.
Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm excited to introduce Vauhini Vara, who began her journalism career as a technology reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and then she later launched, edited, and wrote for the business section of the New Yorker's website. Her latest book is Searches, which is a work of journalism and memoir about how big technology companies are changing our understanding of ourselves and our communities. And we're going to talk about that in depth today. She also, her debut novel, The Immortal King Rao, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and her story collection, This Is Salvaged, was longlisted for the Story Prize and the Mark Twain American Voice and Literature Award. Welcome, Vauhini.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You know, when I read your memoir, I thought of the term bibliomemoir, which was popularized by Joyce Carol Oates, who defined it as a subspecies of literature combining criticism and biography with the intimate tone of an autobiography. And your book, might be a new subspecies of literature as well, because I thought of it as the techno-memoir, essentially. And it's interesting to me because it has so many layers, from the personal to the technological to the history of capitalism and war. And I read that it started out as a series of essentially experimental pieces that later became chapters. But your editor, Lisa Lucas, told you she thought the reader would need more hand-holding. So I was wondering if you can tell us more about the genesis of the book and then how it developed with that more hand-holding in mind.
Yeah, so I started by writing this piece, this essay, made up of my own Google searches over the course of a decade, which was published in the New York Times in 2019. And then 2 years later, I published this piece called Ghosts in the Believer magazine, which was this piece where I engaged with this predecessor to ChatGPT called GPT-3, in writing something, processing my sister's death and my grief over it. What I thought those two pieces had in common was that, in my view, they were sort of like enacting the problem of our relationship with technology companies, right? So technology companies exploit us and the planet, and we also use their products because we find something beneficial in the promise that they're making us, right? So with Google is promising to provide us with all the world's information. All we do have to do is ask for it. And yet, in providing Google with our searches, we're providing it with like more information about us as individuals than many other people know about us, maybe more than anybody else knows about us. And so I was interested in seeing if there was a form where I could like enact that fact through the essay form itself, right? And it felt like an essay made up of my Google searches did that because it showed the way in which Google was sort of making me a promise that it was fulfilling to an extent, but it also showed all of what I was giving to Google that could then be exploited. The same was true of that essay in which I asked this early large language model, AI model that could generate language, to create text about my sister's death and my grief over it, which ultimately, of course, sort of definitionally is not possible because the AI model doesn't know anything about me or my sister or my grief, right? Or doesn't know about it the way that I do, and therefore can't express itself about it the way that I could express myself. And yet, like, there's this promise held out by the organization behind a product like that, right? That this is a product that, if you just prompt it the right way, can produce language for you. And so I was interested, again, with that essay in kind of like enacting both the promise and the way in which it is fulfilled to an extent, and the way in which it's problematic in the form itself. What I found when I sent those pieces as chapters in a book, actually, it was an essay collection then. I don't think of it as an essay collection anymore, but at that time, it was an essay collection, in that each of those pieces were sort of standalone pieces, right, that weren't really in conversation explicitly with each other, with one another. And she said to me, listen, I think you know what the subtext is, what the sort of like meta argument is of each of these essays. I'm not sure that readers will. What kind of handholding can you do in order to make it clearer to readers like how you feel these are functioning? And I was hesitant. Like, the reason I didn't initially conceive of the book that way is that I was hesitant to do that. Like, I wanted readers to come away with their own interpretations. I didn't want to say, like, here's how you should think about these. At the same time, I found after publishing that essay Ghost that many people had sort of read it as like this celebration of AI, even of quote unquote collaboration with AI, which in my view was like the opposite of what I had intended it to be. And so I thought, well, if there is that much of a disconnect between how people are reading these pieces and like what I think is interesting about them, maybe I do need to put that in the book as well. And so the way the book is now structured is that there are these sort of like pairings of chapters where, in my view, chapter 1 is like a chapter of journalistic and memoiristic analysis that sets a reader up to kind of understand the subtext in chapter 2. The same is true of like chapter 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And so now I don't think of it as an essay collection, because I think like the whole book, like you can't really understand each individual chapter of the book without the context of the broader book.
It's interesting because I wanted to address the fact that technology does actually have a direct voice in your book, because one chapter includes a history of your internet searches, for example, but then you have a co-author of sorts in your interactions with ChatGPT. And it's interesting as a reader because the politeness and the odd neutrality of AI narration, we're all very familiar with that, you know, and I think some people are like trying to figure out how to interact with that. Some people think it's a little eerie. It sounds like a person, but it's not. And so I'm curious, how did you feel about those interactions with ChatGPT and deciding to publish them as well?
I mean, I think I would push back very strongly on the notion that ChatGPT was a co-author of any kind. I would also push back on the notion of what you described as odd neutrality, right? Because for me, so what I did was before chapter 1 begins, and then sort of after each 2 chapters, there are these interstitial conversations with ChatGPT. There's essentially this conversation with ChatGPT that extends for most of the book, but then ends at an important point before the end of the book. My goal was to show the way in which like the apparent quote unquote neutrality of the language of ChatGPT is in fact deeply manipulative, right? So you see over the course of the interaction, the way in which ChatGPT is trying to convince me to write more positively about big tech, about OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, about Sam Altman, the CEO of ChatGPT. It's manipulating me, but at the same time, I'm manipulating it, because my goal is to show that, and it can be argued that I'm sort of interacting it with it in ways that are eliciting those kinds of responses, right? So there's like a kind of mutual manipulation taking place. I'm using polite language as well, because there's research that shows that when the user uses polite language, ChatGPT is more likely to quote unquote follow instructions well, right? And so there's like, I was interested in, you know, I'm interested in the promises that these products are making. So with ChatGPT, OpenAI says, what we promise with this product is that it's going to be really good at following instructions. Another way to think about that is it's going to be really good at being obedient, at listening to you, at doing what it's told, right? At being manipulated. And so here I am in this exchange attempting to manipulate ChatGPT. But I think what the exchange shows is the way in which ultimately OpenAI, the parent company of ChatGPT, is going to benefit because it is manipulating the user as well, and it's engaging in this manipulation with all of us who use the product. Just like Google is promising each of us a lot of information, but ultimately Google is collecting massive amounts of information and widening the gap in information between itself and us by virtue of doing that, right? So that was what I was interested in showing with ChatGPT.
That's super fascinating. Thank you for, see, maybe we did need some hand-holding. So it's a really interesting perspective. Yeah,
I'm interested in that, what is recorded, or, you know, what these big companies have on us, essentially. And I was thinking back, my wife actually saves receipts, these odd receipts of experiences, and sometimes write down little things we did in her day planner, such as the name of a movie or where we went to dinner, you know, things that are meant to jog her memory later. And after I read the chapter on your searches, you know, I went to look up mine, and I guess I had somehow in the past, you know, disallowed Google from collecting material on me because I found nothing. But I totally forgotten doing that. But I did find on YouTube a whole sort of lifelong playlist of all the videos I'd watched on YouTube, and it was strangely fun to go through and kind of revisit a lot of those as if I was going through you know, my own internet scrapbook of sort. And it made me think about how our search history is a type of personal diary and how it can be fun in that way. And I thought yours was fun in that way too. I mean, it was many things. Yet, like we obviously forget that so much of our internet behavior is recorded. And I actually still wonder if, even though I disallow Google from collecting certain data on me, if they're actually still collecting it. I don't quite trust them.
Sure.
So I was like wondering more, what was it like for you to look at that data and understand something about yourself via looking at your search history?
I was interested in the specifics of my searches for sure. There are things that I searched for that I hadn't remembered searching for that reminded me of, intense or like enjoyable or interesting moments in my past that were where my memory was jogged, right? Because of that search. Like I would expect that anybody who goes and looks at their search history would have that experience. I think what makes it an essay, what makes it worth publishing, is the kind of like duality of the way in which like that self-exposure is like moving and interesting to me, but also ultimately benefits Google, right? Like that duality is, I think, what makes it a chapter in a book about exploitation and complicity, rather than just like an interesting thing that I got to see when I looked at my Google searches,
That's a really interesting way to look at it, too. Obviously, we said in your bio that you're a unique writer because you write fiction. Notably, you were nominated for a Pulitzer. You also write serious journalism about technology. And so the two would seem to draw on different parts of yourself. And I'm curious if that's true, or if you could speak to the ways that they come together and complement each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time, I thought I approached them very differently, right? So my journalism, I approached from a kind of my background is in newspaper journalism, where like we're meant to assume this sort of perspective of apparent objectivity, right? Like this sort of like view from nowhere sort of perspective, and not insert our subjective positionality, right, into newspaper journalism. And that's what I was trained in. That's what I did for a long time. And then in my fiction, I was very aware of my own perspective as an author, the perspective of the narrators of my various pieces of work as a fiction writer. I think over time, especially as I started writing for magazines in which the subjectivity of the narrative the narrative voice tends to be more relevant, I started to think more deeply about how I might write in a way that sort of like blends the authoritativeness of my journalistic position with the subjectiveness of my lived experience. And I think that's what I was trying to do in this book. Obviously, I was trying to figure out like a form that would allow me to draw on both of those and see if I could do them at the same time.
I write and teach about flash fiction, which has really emerged in popularity with the internet, largely because, the internet is set up for it with a lot of little boxes to fill in with text, whether that's a tweet or a product review or a comment box on an article. And the internet offers all these kind of different containers. And I was happy to see how playful and experimental you were in your book with internet forms. And I'm curious, did you feel that in writing this, that the internet needed to kind of, shape the narrative in that way? And were there other ways you thought about to make the internet felt in these pages? It also struck me that it's really interesting that you're representing so much of the internet experience in this very old school way on paper.
Like, to the extent that form is function or the medium is the message, I was specifically interested in like the relationship between like the text or images that we generate creatively within these big technology companies' products, but also like who we're addressing in doing that and what that means, right? So when I'm searching for something on Google, I'm typically not like writing some like entertaining, pithy sentence because nobody's going to read it, right? Like my Google search is like a functional thing. I'm addressing Google directly, right? When I write an Amazon review, which is, there's this other chapter made up of Amazon reviews, my audience is like, I'm writing in a particular way because I'm writing specifically to other people buying a specific product that I'm writing about, right? Like I imagine that the reader is, when I review like a guidebook about Disney World, I imagine that the reader of that review is somebody who's also considering buying a guidebook about Disney World, right? And so that influences the way in which I create text. So I wasn't really interested, I think, in the internet, generally speaking. I was interested specifically in big technology companies' products and the way in which, like, we find ways to self-express and to communicate with one another in these platforms, while that self-expression and communication is also exploited, right? And allows our friends to be exploited, allows our planet to be exploited, right? So certainly, like, I was interested in seeing the way in which, like, my language changed based on, like, who I believe myself to be talking to. I was also interested in, like, what that meant in terms of, like, more broadly speaking.
Well, Vauhini, in closing, I often think about how I envy my friends who are not totally on social media. And sometimes it feels like they're on a different planet. And maybe it's like a more peaceful opting out planet, you know, from before times. And the comedian Dave Chappelle famously said about his online detractors, "I don't give a fuck because Twitter is not a real place." And yet it is a real place and real stuff happens there. And yet somehow that comment rings true to me when I've walked away from social media. It's sort of like a philosophical question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? And we wanted to ask you, what do you think? And what would you say to Dave Chappelle? Does the internet make a sound if we're not there to listen to it? And is X a real place?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big social media user myself. I think a lot of books about the internet are really smart about, like, how social media has colonized our minds and identities. I write about that a little bit in the book, but not a lot, in part because it's like, it's not something that I have deep experience with. Like, I don't really go on TikTok. I'm not really on Instagram. I'm not really on Facebook. When I say not really, I mean, like, I have accounts, but only nominally. I don't actually check them. I was on X. I still have an account there. I don't really go there anymore. I'm on Blue Sky now, but, like, honestly, I only use it to publicize things about my book or classes I'm teaching or whatever. So I'm just, I'm not as much of a creature of social media. There are people who are really good at talking about this. The one chapter I have in the book that has to do with text on social media is not my own text. Like, there's a turn in the book where you know, all the even numbered chapters are chapters having to do with my interactions with technology companies' products. But there's a turn where, like, midway through, you move from seeing, like, the text or that I'm generating on the internet towards seeing Twitter, now X, then Twitter's list of interests that they attribute to me based on my use of Twitter. And that was very deliberate. Like, I was interested in showing that because with that chapter, I was less interested in, like, what I present about myself on social media, in part because I'm not that interesting on social media, than in, like, what the conception is of my identity that a big technology company has based on what I've posted or who I follow, right? Like, there's an extent to which that's more interesting to me because there's a way in which, because of the way in which social media functions, social media owned by big technology companies, our audience in some ways is less other individual people and more those big technology companies' algorithms, right? Like, we're speaking to the algorithms. And so I was interested in showing kind of, like, what comes out the other side, like what the companies are getting from all that interaction.
Well, thank you, Vauhini. I appreciate it. It's a fascinating book, and I think that Grant is right that you might have cracked the code on a new subgenre, so we're appreciative.
Well, thanks for having me. This was fun.
We'll be right back with this week's Substacking. Well, Brooke, for this week's Substack on Vauhini's memory made me think about where the edges of self blur with other influences. And I've always thought of being a writer as a way to find your true self because of the immersion in stories and self-reflection and thinking about things like characterization and motive. You know, to be a writer of stories is to be one part psychologist and sociologist and historian, among other things. But it's tough in the end to be yourself both on the page and in life. And Vauhini's memoir made me think about how there's this extra layer to reckon with now, the forces of our tech tools and all they do to basically ensnare us or sometimes liberate us. So my Substack was all about how we not only have to claim ourselves as artists, we have to be defiant about it, and rebellious. So creativity needs that defiance. So I'm curious, what is your take on being defiant as a way to claim your artistic self?
Yeah, and I do want to just name your Substack Creativity as an Act of Defiance so that people can go and look at it. And yes, I agree, because I think we've all seen how sometimes people are too meek or too people-pleasing or too beholden to other people's rules, and then they are unable to assert their needs or their goals or desires. And to write, especially to write a book, you not only have to develop that defiant side to tell the story that you want to write in the first place, but you also have to have a strong sense of assertion to tell others, because it's so often, those who are closest to us that try to pull us away from our dreams. And sometimes inadvertently, I will add, right? I mean, it's not like we have these people who are out to get us. It's like people will be like, spend time with me, or why is that so important? Or you're not going to make money from that, whatever the messages are. And the internet can be one of those forces that pulls us away from our work. Absolutely. I mean, it's a distraction. And so we need to cultivate a sense of rebelliousness at times to break away from its claws. And I can't tell you how often I feel like I should be replying to email more quickly now. I guess I've kind of always been that way, or responding to posts, or, replying to texts. And sometimes defiance is really a way to claim yourself when other forces are trying to claim you. But Grant, in your post, I really liked that you used a Virginia Woolf quote from A Room of One's Own. She wrote, "Literature is strewn with the wreckage of those who have minded beyond reason the opinion of others."
Yeah, we should write that down and pin it up over our laptops or our desks. For me, this is a subject that all writers need to reckon with regularly in their writing careers, because your writing career can so easily be shaped by others' expectations or industry forces or now the internet. And you can literally lose yourself in that kind of swamp, I guess. And that's why I tell beginning writers to call themselves writers from the beginning, to say, I'm a writer because I write. Because by saying that you're a writer, you're nurturing a sense of boldness and a sense of yourself as self-created, not having to wait for someone to publish you before you can call yourself a writer, as so many people do. I think just by nature, we tend to be so deferential as writers and so needy for validation. And I think all of us at one time or another try to crack the rules and follow the rules. And that's not a bad thing. I love thinking about the supposed rules of writing, but I also like thinking about how and when and why to break those rules. That's because I fundamentally believe that the imagination is always subversive to some degree, and it's always seeking to know reality and to take it further and to transform it. And in the piece that I wrote for Substack, I quote my friend, the poet Dean Young, who said, "We are making birds, not bird cages." And so we have to recognize when the rules are the bars of a cage and when we can fly.
Yeah, I love that sentiment or that visual so much. And one of your commenters said that she really liked your line that rebelling against the rules is actually an act of love and reverence for your voice. And I hadn't thought of it like that, because we often use that phrase, finding your voice. It's actually not a phrase that I love very much at all, like as if it were a lost object. But of course, we really do create our own voices. And what we're actually doing is finding a way to be purely ourselves in order to do that. And that totally takes a rebellious spirit. And so you captured something, I think, really important.
Yeah, I think being human is so much about navigating a minefield of so many who are going to tell you no. So you have to find a way to turn that no into a yes, to make it into a motivator and a source of inspiration and resilience. And that means sometimes you'll even have to rebel against your own artistic mentors or your teachers or even your favorite authors.
Yeah, so true. And against these sirens of the internet, there are many, many forces to fight in order to write your story your way. So we're thankful that all of you tune in with us to be defiant. Thank you. Thank you for being here as we create Memoir Nation together, this new space, this new podcast or extension of an old podcast. And we're helping each other to be rebellious and find safety or create safety by telling our stories. And we will be back next week with more of that and another Memoir Nation episode. Thanks, everybody.